Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, I've been having a little bit of a reminisce recently. I've been poring over my first short story collection, which this show is named after, Strange Playgrounds, and I've been having this conversation a lot. It's one of those weird things where there's a lot of confluence happening, where I've been pondering this very matter, and then it's come up in conversation, either online or in person, and I've been thinking about how stories coalesce, where they come from, and how they take on this strange animus of their own, how they proliferate and elaborate, and how they spread like a disease from person to person, and then permeate culture. And sometimes they become more than stories, sometimes they become urban myths, sometimes they become pseudo-history where people can't determine what was real and what was not. A very good example of that would be Sweeney Todd. The Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Lots of people do believe that he was a real serial killer in Victorian England. He wasn't. He's a total myth. He's sort of been mixed with lots of other serial killers like Jack the Ripper and whatnot, who was real, but who has been so mythologized that any attempt to find any kind of reality behind the man, he was almost certainly a man, by the way, is almost impossible at this point. I mean, the mythology is now more significant and more culturally pronounced than the reality. Another good example would be Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, who partially inspired Dracula alongside characters, or rather actual people like Elizabeth Bathory. Both of these people, who are actually historically existing people, have become so mythologized and so fictionalized that the stories now matter more than any notion of historical reality. The stories are more mythologically entrenched, to the point whereby I imagine there are lots of people who don't know that Vlad Dracul Tepes was actually a real person at one time. It's bizarre and wonderful to me. I love the way... A very good example is the internet. I was talking just very briefly on Facebook with an author some of you may know, Laura Mauro, who is fucking brilliant, by the way. She's like a rising star in UK speculative fiction. She's really bloody good. She's like she's one of those like women writers who he's breaking new ground when it comes to speculative fiction. She's bringing a new voice to things, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. But I was just having a brief chat with her about internet myths, about the way that tales and stories and myths now permeate, and they elaborate in a much different way because of the media. There was once a time before the existence of social media, before we were all so powerfully connected by devices and by networks, whereby it was always word of mouth. It was always word of mouth. We all remember it too. Do you remember, for example, when you were a kid and your own little local urban myths would come about different landmarks in your very, very localized area, like at school, in the playground, there'd always be a myth about that house or that building or that place. This happened on that field and I saw this, or my cousin saw that. That's how it works. That's how it works. And after a while, these things become accepted. They don't just become accepted, they become parts of our personal narratives, to the point whereby we find it very difficult to divorce ourselves from them. That seems to be the nature of these things, and it's absolutely wonderful. But online, it's taken on a really new animus. These expressions, the reasons these stories coalesce, is because they express very particular concerns within culture, within our local cultures, within wider meta-narratives. It's very, very cool. They occur very naturally because we are naturally narrative creatures. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We perceive things that aren't there. We perceive patterns in waking reality and in our interactions that actually don't exist. And it's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's totally ambiguous. As a result of that, we naturally narrativize everything we come across. We see it's where superstition comes from. We believe, because we perceive particular patterns of cause and effect that actually aren't there, that there's some agency, there's some narrative, there's some poetry to our existence. And if we see that many magpies in a day, or if we see this particular shape in a shadow, then it means it's going to be a good or a bad day or whatever. It's bollocks. It's total, complete fantasy. But because we are so myopic in terms of our perceptions and the way we narrativize things, they become significant to us. And that's where urban legends and urban myths come from. On the internet, it's slightly different. What's happened is we've now got this situation whereby urban legends are no longer localized, whereby they not only spread much faster and much more insidiously, but because the internet is not just a medium, it's an arena and an environment in and of itself, we get urban myths about the internet, or that occur on the internet. The obvious one that everybody knows now is the Slender Man. The Slender Man is a very new creature, historically speaking. He came about only about a decade ago, at most recent. He is not an ancient myth or anything to that effect, but because of the way that particular myth, that particular story has sparked, the way it's latched into people's minds, it's actually transcended the medium. It's no longer a matter of fiction. People now believe it to be either an actual urban legend that has been around for ages, or they believe it's actually real. There are obviously people out there who believe that it's actually real, which is really quite distressing. But the way the Slender Man has taken root and has pervaded popular culture is amazing. The same is true of lots of other urban myths. But the way that the internet is now expressing very old, it's become the arena for expressing very old, very fundamental concerns that are sort of cellular. They are sort of in our DNA, in our genetics, but also within the DNA and genetics of our cultures. But it's not just that. Now, because of the nature of the internet, they've started to mutate. They've started to become their own entities. The internet itself has become its own arena of storytelling, and I love that. I think it's wonderful, despite the fact that there are inevitably negative consequences of that. I mean, there was the case in the US of the two girls who proclaimed that the Slender Man inspired them to stab another young girl. I think that's very dubious myself. But these things do occur, unfortunately, one of the byproducts of this degree of access is that you are going to reach people whose perceptions of reality are perhaps somewhat looser than others, or who are a little bit more skewed or twisted than others, and who can't distinguish between what's real and what's not, who perceive patterns that are much more significant on a personal level. And that's just a natural byproduct of something like the internet, where there is just free access and free expression. It is a sad but natural byproduct. And of stories in general. I mean, books are the same in many respects, written novels. You can happily go down to the library and pick up any number of books that are disturbing, distressing, that contain distressing imagery, which may impact upon people's lives. I mean, a really good example is, I can never remember his name, the guy who shot John Lennon, but he read Catcher in the Rye a lot and became obsessed with it, and sort of bound that story up into his own personal mythology and his own paranoia, and that's part of what skewed his mind and led him down a very dark path. It's sadly part of the process. You are going to get that, and it's no excuse in my mind. It's certainly no justification for any kind of censorship or tighter controls. What it is an excuse for is a society that's more observant and more empathetic and more educated on the nature of mental illness, and which provides far more in the way of support, safe environments, and therapy for people who have social conditions or with mental conditions or whatever. However, I was also thinking about this on a personal level rather than on a meta or mythological level. Like, we all do it. We all form stories in our minds almost every second of every day. We imagine things as they could have gone. We imagine ourselves speaking in this way rather than in that way, of saying that rather than this, of taking that route rather than that route. Our regrets become matters of storytelling. We look back and we imagine what could have been if we'd just done this, if we'd just done that, if we hadn't done this, if we hadn't done that. Everything we do is narrative. Absolutely everything we do. We are Homo sapiens, but also sort of Homo narrative. It's what we are. Or Homo Mythologica. It's what we are. We mythologize everything because that's the way we work. We like to lend our own lives a degree of poetry and meaning, and we do that by interpreting our external input as having pattern, as having meaning, when it, in any objective sense, it doesn't seem to. That is up in the air, really. On a metaphysical level, that's somewhat up in the air, but it doesn't appear to. That just seems to be a distortion of our natures, of how we work, and which we then express on a culture-wide level as oral traditions and as urban legends and as mythologies and so on and so forth. But on a personal level, as someone who writes stories, who creates stories, I'm endlessly fascinated by the process, because it's difficult to analyze. It's very, very difficult, because often they just come from nowhere. It's like you can't analyze why your mind comes up with this image or that concept any more than you can dissect the nature of your own mind itself. You can't, because it's mind assessing mind, and that is impossible. It's impossible to do with even the delusion of objectivity. It's actually it's a paradox. You can't do it. But one can speculate, one can hypothesize, but on an experiential level, I don't know. It just seems to happen. It just seems to happen. You will be sitting in a perfectly familiar room, and your perceptions will shift for some reason, and you will perceive something in the room that somehow looks different to you for some reason, even though it's been there for years, and suddenly a story comes from that. You will be walking down a perfectly familiar street, and you will see a puddle or a leaf or a bit of trash, and you'll wonder, what happened around that puddle? Did someone recently step in it? Did a little girl step in it? Did her mother scold her? Was her mother disappointed in her? Or did she find it funny? Did she encourage her? And suddenly you've got the beginnings of a story there. You've got the beginnings of something that can become narrative. I was reading over Strange Playgrounds, my first short story collection, and there's a story in there called The State of Lovers, and it's one of my favourites I've ever written, actually. I really, really like it. And it came from a really weird place. It came from a discussion, a perennial discussion that a friend of mine, Michelle, have. We are both of us kind of singletons. We don't find relationships very easy. And we were discussing, probably over wine, probably quite drunk one day. We were discussing what would constitute the perfect man for both of us. What would that be? What bits would you take from your ideals and cobble together, both on an aesthetic level and on a personal level? So what bits of personality would they have? What would they express? And it became an almost Frankensteinian thing, where we were talking about what that process would entail. And I thought to myself, well, that would make a really fun inversion of Frankenstein, the story Frankenstein, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that be fun if you had like a female protagonist who is trying to make the perfect mate, like the perfect man, or a gay protagonist? Wouldn't that be interesting? And kind of funny. It's got a kind of gallows humour to it, so it'd be like a horror comedy. And I started writing that story, and it didn't work. It didn't work at all. I couldn't make it work for some reason. The lightness of it and the silliness of it just didn't work for me. So I just stopped, and then, but it wouldn't go away. The idea wouldn't go away. I left it for the longest time. And then I started thinking about, well, what does that imply? The desire for perfection in a mate, for one's own ideals of perfection, what does that imply? Well, for me, it implies a kind of neurosis. It implies a desire for control. It implies an inability to cope with the reality and the complexities and ambiguities of people. It's wanting to have people as cartoon characters, as bound and contained and controllable. And that's a very dark thing. That's a very dark concept to deal with, especially when you're applying that interpretation to yourself, to your own experience of relationships. So I thought, that's interesting. That's way more interesting, actually. So I started writing it again, and rather than being like sort of science fiction fantasy, it became metaphysical. It's about a woman who, she dreams her perfect lover, and he appears, and it's as though he's always been there. It's almost like history and reality have rearranged around themselves to create this guy. However, it's not right. There's something wrong. He can't fulfill her standards of perfection because they are ambiguous, because they're constantly changing and they're contradictory. So what you have is this situation where the guy, the entity, the guy is sort of torturing himself and tearing himself apart, trying to fulfill this impossible ideal. Meanwhile, she is watching this and finding it impossible to cope with. So the desire for perfection defeats itself. It becomes this very unflattering mirror. And she learns this. She learns this, that the desire for perfection is something that reflects back on herself, and she lets him go. It's a really sad and very dark moment where she lets him go in this moment of utter abjection and despair. She recreates him and lets him just be his own entity. And in the end, she turns this capacity for rewriting reality on herself. It's a really, I'm really pleased with that story. I really am, because of the way it came out and what it implies and the complexity of it. I really am very proud of that story. But it's the way it evolved. The way it evolved is so weird, from this idle, jokey, stupid conversation into this very intense personal analysis of what I want and of what that says about me. I thought it was brilliant. The experience was brilliant. The experience of it was brilliant. It really was. And it's a very good example of how stories come from our subconscious and they try to tell us things. Our subconscious is trying to tell us something that we should probably listen to. It's trying to give us a life lesson that we should probably fucking listen to. You know? I thought I was so pleased with that. The title story, Strange Playgrounds, came from a similar place. I mean, Strange Playgrounds I started writing in university when I was probably too young to do it, to be honest. I was like 20-something and very green around the gills when it came to writing. But we were studying Edgar Allan Poe in one of my, I think it was like an American Gothic class. And we were reading The Pit and the Pendulum, which I absolutely adore. I really absolutely adore The Pit and the Pendulum and all of Edgar Allan Poe's stuff. However, what I've never liked about The Pit and the Pendulum is that it's a fantastic work of horror. I mean, it is absolutely sublime up to a point, and that point is where you find out what is happening. It starts with, it's very perceptual, it's very impressionistic. You've got this guy who is in total darkness. He's strapped down and he doesn't know where he is. His whole experience is disorientation and confusion, and he can hear rats and he can perceive things in the distance, but he doesn't know where he is, and that is so terrifying. It's so terrifying. But you do get some explanation for what's happening towards the end, and it's like, that kills it for me. I don't want to know why he's there. The strength of the story is its impressionistic detail. So it's the little aches and pains. It's the horror of feeling rats and things scurrying over his bound body. It's the sounds and smells in the dark. It's absolutely brilliant. So I thought, well, what if I could start out with the same premise and then write a story where there was no explanation, where it was just these impressions of this guy trying to find out why the fuck he's here. Can't quite remember where he is. He's slightly disoriented. He wakes up in total darkness, and he's like you get the impression that he's in some sort of subterranean place. It's really very, very dark indeed. And it's all impressions. And the challenge of it, of course, was that I couldn't use sight. I couldn't use visual images because he couldn't see anything. He's in total subterranean darkness. So I had to use smell and touch and sound, and that's where it started. That's where it started off, and that became the framing device for the entirety of the short story collection. Again, I am quite proud of, I've got to say, reading back over it. I think it works very well. It's a bit naive. It's not quite as technically tight as it could be, but I am quite proud of it. It's so weird though. It's where the story came from that fascinates me. Another one, in Essential Atrocities, my other short story collection, which was published recently, there's one in there called what's it called? Hang on, I will have a look through. Where are we? Oh dear, this bodes well. Beautifully Broken, of course it's Beautifully Broken. What the fuck is wrong with you, George? Beautifully Broken. Beautifully Broken is a really strange story for me. It's a really weird one because it's about regret. It's about regret, despair, suicidal tendencies, and eroticism. And it comes from a really weird confluence of things. I was having a chat with another friend of mine who also happens to be gay, and we were talking about. I made the glib offhand comment that human beings can make anything erotic because that's our nature. It's why that you can find basically any kind of form of eroticism on the internet. And he was like quite dubious. He was saying, "I'm not sure about that. How could you make depression sexy? How could you make depression erotic? Because it is by its very nature thanatic. It is by its very nature the entirely opposite of eroticism." And I was like, okay, challenge accepted. And I started writing this story about a guy who has enormous regrets about a relationship he could have had at university and didn't. And as a result of that, he feels that his life went down a particular path when it could have been different. It could have been so much better insofar as he's concerned. And I started to bind that up with one of my own regrets, which is a similar situation, whereby there was a guy I knew at university who I knew liked me, but I was too mired in my own depression and social anxiety to do anything about it. I wasn't ready for a relationship back then. I just wasn't. It couldn't have worked. It just could not have worked. So I made that into the story, and it became this weird, erotic, metaphysical thing about twisted reality and ghosts and the potential for despair to rip open reality and change it, change the narrative, change the course of one's existence. And it's one I am quite proud of because I think it comes from an earnest place, but it's all the images and all the experiences and the initial challenge that went into making that framework. It's so weird. The suite of things that you draw on to create these confections, these stories, is amazing. And often much of it is subconscious. You can't identify even that clearly. It just happens. These images just erupt out of nowhere. But it fascinates me. It fascinates me on every level. Like how we personally narrativize everything, how we create stories from just normal everyday experiences, and how culture does it. How culture creates its own grand narratives that maintain its own assumptions and structure. The delusion of civilization and society. It's an endlessly fascinating well of obsession for me. Because what I write are meta-narratives, really. I mean, if you go and read any of my short stories, they are meta-narratives. They're stories about stories, ultimately. Even though they're not like, say, Stephen King's, which are literally writing about writing. It's not that. It's about self-mythologization and how that can be a gateway to transcendence. But it is fascinating to me, and I would love to talk about it a little more, which I believe I will on an up-and-coming episode. I will root out something a little bit more specific for it, though. Until then, ladies and gents, thank you so much for listening to me waffle on, and I will speak to you soon. Bye-bye!